know if you can't. I would like to introduce Chris Armstrong. Today is series number 7 in a series of monthly webinars, and this is Building an Architecture Platform. So Chris, over to you. Thanks.
All right, thanks very much, Birgit. And welcome everybody to today's webinar on capability-based planning, part 2. And let me get up to the beginning here. All right, so hopefully everyone by now has got the gist of APG's background, participating in industry standards at the Open Group and the OMG and the Eclipse Foundation, and partners with a number of tool vendors. So what we're going to do here is kind of do a quick review, some of the highlights of what we talked about last time. We'll review a little bit of TOGAF, the ADM, and the context capabilities have within the framework, particularly in the development method and the content metamodel. We'll review the tailored capability-based planning metamodel, talk about how can we use it to map enterprise content to it, such as business processes and applications. Take a look at some of the different ways we can analyze the content related to capabilities once we've done that mapping, and then demonstrate how we can do some of this planning and monitoring in some of the available commercial tools. So I'm sure everyone's familiar with the ADM, again, a technique and framework for applying enterprise architecture best practices for a particular outcome. And what we talked about last time was some of the things that we need to do in the preliminary phase to come up with a tailored capability-based framework metamodel, how we can then use that capability model. Once it's been built, we can provide some attributes toward it as it relates to the types of the capabilities, category, different kinds of metrics, and then actually, then generate some different capability viewpoints to inform us, where we might want to make some of our investments when we're doing architecture work. So that's kind of about where we left off. I'll do a quick review of some of the diagrams and viewpoints that we created. So now we're going to talk about, how can we use that capability model for mapping things such as processes and applications in phases B, C, and D, and then how we can then use that viewpoint as a way of identifying what bodies of work need to be done as it relates to those capabilities, and try to describe how those bodies of work unfold over time. So here we have the tailored fit-for-purpose capability-based planning metamodel. This is a little different than what we showed before. We basically kind of simplified it to really represent what we're actually doing here in this particular webinar. So we've got, again, the whole idea that a value chain is a composition of a set of value streams. Those value streams are an aggregation of capabilities. Those capabilities have a number of different properties. You can see some of the enumerated values in the green boxes in the upper right as it relates to investment disposition, category type, performance level, maturity level, as well as some placeholders for rolled up metrics that are going to come from the application for the health score, risk score, and annual cost. And then we've got, similar set of attributes for an application, since we're going to take an application-driven view as it relates to changing the capability landscape. And so same sort of attributes. This is where we actually have the raw data for the health, risk, and cost for an application, as well as the investment disposition, its operational status, is it proposed, rejected, developed, operational, decommissioned, so on and so forth, and then a set of key dates related to those operational states. Also mapped to capability is going to be a process. And again, we're just looking at this being the most simplest approach, but of course there's quite a number of other elements that we could map into capabilities, although you do need to be careful about allowing everything to be mapped directly to a capability, because that can really cause a little bit of confusion both in the users and the consumers of the content. So general recommendation is try to limit the direct traceability to capability as minimally as possible, where other relationships to other elements can be derived because of their relationships to intermediate elements. So for example, we could roll up technology to capability through application, but it might not be the best choice to directly trace technology to capability. But ultimately, that really depends on your use case and your situation. So we basically have processes and applications being mapped to capabilities, and then something that we'll see a little bit later is the idea that there are a set of requirements associated with improving or operating a capability, and some of those may be allocated to applications that support the capability as well as processes that support the capability. So when we're performing activities in particularly phases B, C, and D, this is an excerpt out of the APG TOGAF process library, a CLIPS-based tool that we've created to represent TOGAF content and allow people to tailor it. So this is what, this basically represents the 9-step program of phases B through D. And even though it doesn't really come out and say this, although this may be content that we address in a forthcoming white paper from the open group, is the idea that, when we're in step 1, when we're selecting reference models, viewpoints, and tools, we need a capability model as a reference model for mapping. When we're developing the baseline and target architectures, we're going to map elements of the business data application technology architecture to that capability model in some fashion per our Metamodel. We want to be able to perform gap analysis, and gap analysis can be very effectively done through a capability lens, as well as resolving impacts across the architecture landscape. That's really a call out to having some kind of integration between your portfolio planning tool and your capability model, because what would be really nice is that if you could pop into your PPM tool and run a query and say, show me all projects that are touching these capabilities, and that would give you immediate intelligence on what kind of, which stakeholders you might need to engage with based on the capabilities that you're touching. And then finally, in this 8th step, when finalizing the architecture, in addition to, again, developing the baseline and target architecture description, we may also decide that we want to create more details around what the actual capabilities are, the dependencies those capabilities have on other capabilities, different types of requirements, perhaps that may be associated with maturity level, for example. So, what we're going to do here is I'm going to do a little bit of, showing you some screenshots of some tooling in PowerPoint, and then flipping to the live tool. We're basically going to, review the Metamodel and the UML profile. We've already imported capability metrics and heat maps, but now what we're going to do is we're going to import application metrics and map those to capabilities, and then create capability-based application heat maps, and then continue on the voyage in describing the baseline and the target architecture, identifying the gaps between the baseline and the target, and then identifying a set of requirements that are going to fulfill those gaps as it relates to delivering the target architecture through a series of work packages. And so the application inventory, in this case, came from a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. So here we have a list of all the applications, and again, we're going to be, focusing on IT applications in the context of the IT for IT reference architecture. So, we have each of the applications, a health score and a risk score. Again, what formula and raw data you collect to come up with those health scores and risk scores is a topic of an entire webinar probably by itself. But a lot of times health, again, is based on things like how old the application is, how old the technology the application is based upon, the availability of skilled resources to work on the application based on the platform, and risk might be related to similar attributes or things related to technology risk and other security vulnerabilities. Total annual cost, again, we're doing the simple thing. A lot of people like to break that down into different dimensions, including, licensing costs and labor costs and operational costs, for example. Then we've got an investment disposition as it relates to, the way management wants to think about, how do we, steward these applications moving forward using a real simple 3 sets of categories: retire, maintain, and strategic. And then for some of the elements that we'll see a little bit later, we've actually populated some of the life cycle dates as it relates to when was this application proposed, when does development start, when does it become operational, when is it going to be, when does decommissioning begin, when is decommissioning completed, and then when is it finally retired. And so what we did with this is that we, imported that spreadsheet into the IT for IT reference model, into a special part of the model related to the baseline application architecture. So let me flip over there and show a quick look at that. And so here we've got, the list of IT applications that have been imported and their strategic disposition, their health score, risk score, and total annual cost. And so what we had done, previously is that we had, created some heat maps automatically from the value chain. So here's, the 4 different parts of the IT for IT value chain: strategy to portfolio, requirement to deploy, request to fulfill, detect to correct. And then the different capabilities related to each one of those. And then, based on the capability content, which we can, see over here, we've got a whole bunch of attributes about the capability that we, again, also imported in the previous webinar. So things about, again, the category type, investment disposition, maturity, and performance levels in the current and future. And then, as you'll see in a little bit, all of the aggregate application metrics are zeroed out right now. But, what we were able to do is take that data and then build a heat map and then apply an analytic to it that allows us to color code based on our investment disposition. And so, we look at the ones that are considered to be strategic, for example, that we're going to take a closer look at is going to be architecture and requirements management and, let's see, and then I think IT portfolio management. So what we're going to do is we're going to, basically do a similar sort of thing now, and we've also imported a mapping between the capabilities and the applications that also came from an Excel spreadsheet. So let me just call up real quick what the results of doing that work is. And so here we see all of the applications as rows on the left, all of the capabilities as columns on the top. And then whenever there's a relationship between an application and a capability, again, we can see that at the intersection of the 2 cells showing that there's a relationship. And as you'll see a little bit later, not only are these relationships being showed in this traceability matrix, they're actually first-class relationships that we'll be able to see within diagrams. And so, now that we've got a relationship between applications and capabilities, one of the things that we can do is we can go ahead and create another heat map, but let's, focus on one part of the value chain that we're most concerned about. And let's go ahead and create what we're calling an application hierarchy diagram. We're going to tell it to only include elements in the baseline architecture. So it's basically going through the capabilities related to the strategy to portfolio value stream, and then for each of those coming out with the related applications as they've been mapped to at least, again, represent that hierarchy. And then once this is completed, then we'll go ahead and apply a heat map to this that represents the investment disposition of these applications. And so here we can see that particularly in some of the places that we might want to focus on, including also service demand management. Architecture, we've got some tools that we've highlighted for retirement, but we've got some strategic disposition towards maintaining investments in the latest version of Sparks and our model flow tool for enabling exchange between enterprise architecture tools. Also seeing that, single tools are being used for multiple different capabilities. So we can see, Sparks is being used not just for architecture, but for requirements management, as is Redmine. But we can also see that Redmine is also being used for service demand management. And Redmine, for those that aren't familiar with it, is basically a web-based issue tracking system very similar to Bugzilla or Jira or other types of options that are out there. So now that we've kind of got an idea what the the applications data is, we've viewed that mapping between the applications, we've created an application hierarchy diagram. Now let's go and aggregate those application metrics up to the capability model. And so I'm basically going to run another script that's going to aggregate the capability application data. And that's basically going through every capability that's related to a chunk of the value stream, going to the associated applications, and either just doing a sum of the total annual cost or doing an average of the risk and health score. And then once this is done, we're going to be able to, again, analyze, and visualize, what some of those different dimensions are as those application metrics are rolled up to the higher level capabilities. All right, so now let's go take a look at the capability inventory. And so here is the data before it was rolled up. I'm going to basically reload it. And we should be able to see now we have average health scores, average risk scores, and total annual cost. And we're just going to pick one of those, health score, which is just a number between 1 and 10. And for whatever it's worth, all of the risk and health score and cost information is just a set of random numbers in this demonstration. But of course, like we talked about before, you really do want to have a methodological and empirical basis for calculating that, if possible, to avoid subjectivity. And so then let's go ahead and create another heat map, or hierarchy diagram for the capabilities. And then what we'll do after that is then apply an analytic that represents the underlying capability application health. So now with a new capability heat map, we'll go ahead and apply the capability health score analytic. And that's similarly going to color code things red, yellow, and green based on their health score. And the dimensions, as shown by the legend at the bottom, is things that are red have low health, things that are yellow are medium, so they have a score of 4 to 6, and things that are high have a health score of 7 to 10. So we see that there are, opportunities to improve all over the place, and it turns out what we're going to do as the basis for demonstrating some of the planning activities is we're going to pick the architecture capability to uplift, the service demand capability to uplift, requirements management, and IT portfolio management. So let's go ahead and take a look at, how we can represent that content in the baseline architecture. So we're going to start off by, just creating a representation of the current state of those small set of applications. So here we basically are trying to demonstrate that, we're using 2 different modeling tools, System Architect and Enterprise Architect. We've created our own homegrown application portfolio management tool, and again are using Redmine also for doing service demand management, which helps us inform us when we need to make changes to applications. The big thing that you can see here is, again, multiple modeling tools, as well as the fact that the APM tool and Redmine, the issue management tool, are being, basically integrated by the intercession of a person as an intermediary, so the portfolio manager. So this is basically trying to represent that, the portfolio manager goes into Redmine, looks at a certain set of projects that are pertinent to demand management, and then re-enters that content into the APM tool. So it's, certainly clearly an opportunity for reducing some complexity and error issues, as well as, if we've, got a situation where perhaps we can, converge on a standard set of modeling tools, maybe we can deprecate one of those. And so, what we want to be able to do is then, so we're using this to kind of, take an application-centric approach. You could also take a process-driven approach or a service-driven approach, but somehow we need to start off by identifying what's the context of the problem that we think we want to solve. So that's the, basically the baseline application architecture. And then now that we know that, now we can do a capability mapping and basically show, which applications that we've decided are within scope, how they map to different capabilities. And again, this came from the capability application mapping. But while we're at it, just to make it a little bit more interesting and not just simply related to applications, let's trace some processes to it based on, again, the meta model. So we've got a couple processes, one around enterprise architecture and solution architecture for the architecture capability, and we've decided to put the configuration of IT tools in the architecture capability. Certainly claims could be made it might be best elsewhere, but at least for demonstrations we're going to go with that. We've got a requirements management process, a product demand, a development demand process, and an application portfolio process. And you'll notice that they, both the applications and the processes have different versions. And then what we're able to do, with this is then we can go ahead and actually come up with the ability to define what's called a plateau. And so a plateau, we're taking a cue here from Archimate, as that's kind of the base notation we've been using with some, again, custom extensions with the UML profile for capability-based planning. And so let's go down and take a look at the plateau for what we're calling the IT operating model version 2.0. So we're basically trying to represent, that's the current state. It's the baseline architecture. And it's, again, representing a subset of the complete enterprise baseline architecture, that subset of which we're interested in for this body of work. Since we've done a little bit of context analysis by identifying the applications that are related to it and then understood the mapping to capabilities, and then understood, the processes that are related to those capabilities based on the applications, as well as a specific business actor. We've created explicit aggregation relationships from the IT operating model plateau to the capabilities, applications, and processes. And then one of the things that we can do after that is that we can then, we actually also, again, remember, have life cycle dates associated with each of these. So if we look over at the lower right-hand side and look under tagged values, you can see that we've got some dates, for some things related to their development date, operational date, retirement date, decommissioning date, so on and so forth. Again, this might be content you're managing, explicitly in your EA repository. Again, it might come from a PPM, might come from an APM tool. And with this, now one of the things that we can do is we can actually create a application lifecycle roadmap. And so we're going to run another script to do that. And again, I'm going to tell it that I only want to include elements from the baseline architecture. And so this is creating a, basically a time-based kind of Gantt chart that's not, unfamiliar perhaps to many, where we're basically listing the applications and their life cycle dates, but organizing them, again, by capability to kind of give us a good idea of how things are unfolding over time. You'll notice for a couple of applications, apparently we haven't specified any life cycle dates. So that would have to be, this would be an opportunity for someone to go back into the source data and specify those so that they're complete. It turns out that while we've got a great affinity towards the HP Enterprise Maps solution for IT portfolio management, we're really not quite ready to pull the trigger on it yet. We're still, just haven't quite hit critical mass on that. So we're going to stick with uplifting the APM tool in the meantime. And it turns out the Oracle demand planning is something that we want to kind of deprecate and actually fold into the next version of the APM tool. And just a brief review on application lifecycle dates. Here we see basically a state machine diagram in UML that's representing again some of the complexities that we often find when we're doing application portfolio management. First of all, that there are two sets of states that we're interested in. Again, the strategic disposition of an application, the idea that someone thinks we need it, so it needs to be requested. Then that causes us to go into the operations lifecycle, where we're going to assess the viability of that new application. We're going to then approve it for development. It then gets under development, which also causes the strategic state to change to acquiring, which then allows us to be in the invest mode after we've achieved the operational state once the product's been developed and then eventually deployed. As that application is operational, we can decide to contain it, or we can decide we're going to divest from it. And the consequence of that ultimately really results in the operational decommissioning of that application. But sometimes, again, the decommissioning it's just not as simple as turning something off. We may have to archive things. We certainly may have to do data migration, sever dependencies on other applications. And then finally, the application is decommissioned, which puts it into the retired state. So, now that we've kind of got a little bit of an idea of, of what we got, and we need to think about a little bit of where we're going. So, I'm kind of going through an iterative version of the ADM. So, there's no reason that you can't start doing some preliminary planning, very early on in the life cycle. Again, you want to be careful that you don't interpret the crop circle as a, linear sequence of activities. So, we're going to start off, talking about, well, at least a little bit of a look ahead, that one of the things we need to be able to do is consolidate the results of gap analysis, as well as understanding some of the dependencies between the different elements. We need to put together our strategy for transforming the organization, and certainly Phase E is really about some of that coarse-grained strategic decision-making. And then identify and group the major work packages, which we're going to demonstrate. But again, being able to do some of these activities in the context of a capability model can be very helpful and informative. So the first thing we'll do is, take a look at, how we're, actually describing the target state. So we've created an actual, a new plateau to represent, IT operating model version 2.1. And what's going to be delivered by that plateau is increased enterprise architecture reuse. We're going to do that, as you'll see in a little bit, by removing one of the architecture tools, which creates an impedance mismatch between the EA and solution delivery communities. We want to streamline our service demand management capability. It's just a little bit overly complicated, particularly as it relates to, an individual having to copy data from one system to another, and really try to, uplift the service demand capability itself to be a little bit more high performing. And then as a side effect, it's always good to reduce the complexity of the IT landscape by, removing superfluous or extra applications and trying to more tightly integrate applications with one another. So what we're going to do with the target application architecture, and I'll just walk you through real quickly how we came up with this. And this is obviously a very, very simplified example. Obviously major transformation efforts involve, not just 3 or 4 applications, but 10 or 20 or 100 applications. But this one's real simple. We're basically eliminating IBM System Architect, but to do that we have to be able to get some of the diagram data out of that repository, which the current version of Model Flow, or at least 1.3, doesn't support. So we're going to have to upgrade Model Flow to version 2.0. And it turns out that there's a brand new version of Redmine coming out, so we might as well upgrade to the latest and greatest there. And let's create a new version of the APM tool, mostly to accommodate direct integration with the new version of Redmine. And so the way that this works, within the tool, if we go take a look at the target architecture, in particular around the application integration. Again, we see the same simple four element diagram, but the way that this was created, I just wanted to quickly demonstrate that, or at least explain it. The idea is that you start off with the baseline architecture, and here maybe I'll just do this just to kind of show the idea. Copy all the elements off it, and then create a new diagram, and place all of the same elements on it. But then the idea is that we can right mouse click over a particular element and basically tell it to create a new version. So let's right mouse click over model flow version 1.3 and execute a script to create a new version of the selected elements. So we of course could select multiple elements at once, but I'm just going to do it the simple way. And basically what it wants to know is what's the new version, and I'm just going to, to differentiate it from version 2, I'm going to call it version 1.4. That's the internal version number. I'm going to update the version number in the application name, and it wants to know, what architecture plateau this should be a part of, and I'll say it's a part of the target. And so what this has done is it's actually gone and created a brand new element in the model that has traceability to the previous version of the element, so we can, again, maintain that pedigree of ancestors and descendants over time. But then it goes ahead and actually copies all of the relationships that that element has with all other relationships. So basically the whole idea is that I can then remove application APG model flow version 1.3 from the diagram. Again, I don't want to delete it from the model. And then I can move the new version in and then make changes to it. For example, I want to remove its direct connection to IBM Rational System Architect. So once we're done with that, we have to create, new elements. But we need to preserve the old ones, but we want to, again, copy all that content from it. And so this is, again, a simple way to, again, create new elements that preserve all the properties and relationships of its ancestor element, and then allow you to change it and do some comparisons between the two. So I'm going to go ahead and actually delete this so it doesn't clutter up the data that I've already got in there. And so again, the real future state diagram is represented by this. So now that I've got an idea what's in the target state, I can do a capability mapping of the elements in the target, which of course is very similar to, and is actually created in a very similar fashion. We basically copy the capability mapping from the baseline architecture and then replace it with the new elements that we created. So here we can see, and again, a new version of model flow, Redmine, and the APM tool. And then we actually created new versions of the architecture process and the IT configuration process and the service, the manage product development demand process. Turns out that we felt that we really didn't need to change anything about solution architecture or requirements management. We did have an idea, and this is very typical, when we're doing this kind of planning, that we wanted to tackle, trying to do some convergence on requirements management, but decided that that was perhaps a little bit more than we needed to do right now, because again, we have two tools, Redmine and Sparks, that help us with that. And to be quite honest, just not really sure if we really want to replace one completely with another, because there may be a viable reason why we want to have some interoperability in multiple tools for that. And similarly, it turns out we didn't need to really change anything about how we manage the IT portfolio, just again focusing on service demand management. So now once we have that capability mapping done, we can then, again, define, like we talked about, the plateau, its related deliverables, but then actually get into, again, the similar sort of mapping we saw before, where we had the capabilities mapped to the plateaus, the new and existing applications and new and existing business processes. And so now that I've actually created two different plateaus and associated a set of elements between them, I can go and do a what's called a, basically a plateau comparison, which is how we can do gap analysis. So I'm basically going to select the two plateaus, and I'm going to execute the compare plateaus script. And so this is something where we actually went outside Enterprise Architect. I'd like to be able to actually display this within the Enterprise Architect user interface, but we're working on that one. But here we basically have, the two plateaus that we're comparing to one another, the baseline and the target, start and end dates, and then here is the representation of all of the elements that are in the baseline, the target, and or both. And it's been automatically color-coded so that the elements that are in the baseline that are in the target have a gap of preserve, so they're color-coded as green. Elements that are in the baseline but are not in the target are represented as eliminate gaps, and so those are shown as red. And the new things that we need to create are shown in blue. So this is, based on the fact that we created two different plateaus. We created new versions of existing elements and changed their disposition. We can, have the tool automatically analyze for us, what the gap is between the baseline and the target architecture. And just a little bit about that. Again, the whole idea is when we think about, we've got elements, architectural elements in our baseline architecture. We have elements in our target architecture. They are going to be mapped to reference architecture elements. Again, that's a call out to the IT for IT reference architecture and capability model. And that when we compare an element in the baseline to the target, it's related to a gap, and then that gap is going to be addressed by one or many requirements. And the gap, there's basically a disposition. What are we going to do? Are we going to eliminate it, preserve it, update, create a thing? And then for the strategy, are we going to reuse an existing thing, develop something, or are we going to go buy something? So this gets into, again, some of those coarse-grained decisions that we're often asked to make in Phase E, opportunities and solutions. And then the idea is that, once we've got, plateaus defined, and one of the things that's also that I'll show you in just a little bit is we actually did associate with each of the new or changed applications and processes a set of requirements. And so this is just kind of a meta model trying to represent, what a plateau is and how it's composed of and how it relates to, again, a roadmap. So we have the idea that, a plateau is an aggregation of a set of architectural elements, and that if there's a gap, that's going to be fulfilled by a requirement. But what we're going to do now is transition into a little bit more of the planning, where we'll talk about how we're going to come up with a set of work packages, which are, really think of those as prototypical programs and projects. And of course, they likely would have a bunch of metadata associated with them as well, particularly start date, end date, interdependencies between work packages, as well as cost and risk attributes. So let's just take a quick look how we defined, the target architecture implementation. And so we create a plateau implementation diagram, which is a part of the migration and implementation and migration extensions to Archimate. We're basically saying, well, based on, the mapping of the target architecture. So if we go take a look again at that real quick. Again, we can quickly see from the version, this is the target. That we need to, it seemed to us that we needed to do 3 different projects. And so we're going to have, basically one for uplifting Enterprise Architect to do Enterprise Architecture and retire System Architect. We've got, again, an upgrade to our APM tool as it relates to integrating with Redmine directly and doing more service demand management. And because of that, we're going to have to make some updates to model flow, again, particularly to allow it to exchange diagram information with System Architect. And so what we can do is we can actually then go ahead and, create a higher level mapping diagram that shows us the 3 different work packages, the explicit requirements that are related to each business process and each application. So what I found is, the most effective way to build this is to really, you fill up the middle column, work packages last. So you basically come up with, identify the processes that are impacted, the applications that are impacted, and then talk about, well, what are the requirements that are going to have to be implemented in the context of that process or application to meet the needs of the target architecture and the deliverables of the target plateau. So when it comes to the process of configuring tools, we're going to have to migrate data, migrate the Metamodel, set up a EA repository for Sparks, and shut down the SA servers to uplift the capability around using Sparks for enterprise architecture. We're going to have to develop some enterprise architecture best practices because the organization perhaps has been using Sparks predominantly for solution delivery, and then we need to train those architects on usage of Sparks for enterprise architecture. We're going to improve the demand management process, a couple of tweaks that we've been interested in implementing there, and of course we're going to have to train the product managers on those new updates. And then when it comes to the application, we're going to have to actually implement the SA diagram conversion and model flow. We're going to have to build an EA Metamodel and implement it in what's called an MDG technology, pretty much similar to what we saw earlier as it relates to a UML profile. And for the APM tool, we're going to implement integration with Redmine and implement some new product demand management capabilities. And then while we're at it, since we're touching Redmine, let's go ahead and upgrade to the latest version. And so now that we've got this, one of the things that's very nice to be able to do is then deliver a capability-based view of how are we expecting to perhaps deliver upon the target architecture. And so what I can go ahead and do is go back to the definition of the plateau, select the plateau, and basically tell it to create a capability requirement report. And you'll see this is going to be using also an HTML, in this case, in particular, a JavaScript-enabled web page. And so here we can see all the requirements associated with the plateau. And, we're using a particular jQuery add-in here that allows us to do some sorting. So here we've got it, again, sorted by capability. And then I'm going to go ahead and sort it by process. So here we can see, for the architecture capability, here are all the requirements that are related to it and the associated work packages. But of course, I can also, one of the nice things about being able to view this content this way is I can view it by work package. So if I'm really interested in seeing, what are the requirements related to each work package and which capabilities are we touching, I could look at this particular view. And of course, we could also, visualize this graphically within Enterprise Architect as well. So we can see that the APG tool upgrade is going to impact IT portfolio management or possibly update IT portfolio management, requirements management, service demand management. The model flow is going to update architecture, and the Sparks for enterprise architecture is going to, of course, impact enterprise architecture, but also possibly requirements management. And you're actually seeing, one of the consequences of, directly mapping things is that we often find that a single application is related to multiple capabilities like Redmine and Enterprise Architect. And this can introduce a little bit of fuzziness into some of the reports that come out of this because, basically this report is saying, hey, I'm going to all of the work packages related to this plateau, finding all the requirements that are related to each of the work packages, and then finding all of the elements that are related to those requirements, which would be processes or applications, and then finally trace that to the related capability. Well, we may end up finding, again, some redundancy, and so this is where many people will often introduce an intermediate element between capability and application that allows us to describe a little bit further. So when we say Sparks supports enterprise architecture, solution delivery, and requirements management, what do we mean by that? How much? And that additional data point can help, clarify some of the more fuzzy stuff that comes out when we do direct many-to-many mapping. All right, so that's basically what I had for you guys. Now, if I'd had a little bit more time, which of course there is never enough of that, is to show how once we've put that those set of work packages into place and fine-tune those in phase F, migration planning. That's where again we might get some additional risks, some more accurate cost and impact assessments, which could potentially affect the target architecture. One of the things that would certainly be useful is being able to demonstrate multiple transition architectures. Again, I chose a very simple state of just going from the baseline to the target, but using all these techniques, we could possibly have then backtracked from the target architecture and created one or many interim transition architectures in a very similar fashion. And then the other thing would be able to get a sense of, what's the delivery roadmap as it relates to capabilities. So, that's basically where we could create a viewpoint very similar to what we saw for the application lifecycle roadmap, where instead of each of the rows being an application, each of the rows would be a work package, and we could see the start and the end dates of those work packages, again, using a capability lens. And so that's, again, a nice entry point into phase G, implementation governance. And then as we, transition, as projects unfold during phase G, we would expect that those project financials and time estimates would get refined and updated, and we could actually then run additional viewpoints that would show us, again, capability investments increasing over time. We could create a capability heat map that demonstrates where are we making current investments. That could be very useful in the context of the understanding the impact this project has on other things across the landscape. Remember step 6 in the architecture description process. And then again, and then once those things are actually put into operation, we could then revise our maturity level metrics, our risk and health and cost metrics in the applications, roll that back up to the new version of the capability model and see how that's different. And then, of course, in then phase H, use the capability model with its associated metrics as a way to monitor where, again, investments are being made and where risks and opportunities are, so that we can, fire off another cycle of architecture development starting with phase A again. So, basically in, summarization, as I hope that, the people that are attending, there are, capability-based planning is definitely an emerging best practice. TOGAF doesn't provide a lot of explicit guidance. Again, we're hoping that some future white papers and guides from the Archimate and Architecture Forum will provide some clarity in that, as well as perhaps the next version of TOGAF. Just as a reminder, if you look at the TOGAF content meta model out of the box, or 9.1, it focuses capabilities particularly as related to work packages, and while hopefully, we've certainly demonstrated that work packages and capabilities are certainly have an affinity, that capabilities are very important from the very beginning of the architecture lifecycle. We need to be thoughtful about what we really expect out of using a capability model. I mean, we don't want to create one just because we can. We want to make sure that we really understand the stakeholders and the opportunities. I mean, are we trying to do, again, just overall general capability improvement? Are we trying to, simplify the IT landscape as it relates to capabilities? Are we trying to do business process management improvement around the capabilities, or a little slice of all of that? But again, what you're going to use the capability for is going to be, obviously make a big influence into the kind of metadata that you're going to have to keep track of and how you're going to have to set up your repository. including, again, what architectural elements you're going to allow mapping to. Again, in this example, we kept it really simple, applications and processes. And hopefully it was useful to see how, a very affordable solution like Enterprise Architect is capable of, supporting capability-based planning, but it does require some customization through, again, creating a UML profile to represent the meta model, and then deploying that to users and model repositories via what's called an MDG technology. We've found a general issue in enterprise architecture tooling, irrespective of the tool, that we always need to be able to get data from other repositories, again, CMDBs, PPM tools, APM tools, IT finance tools, and so, we need to make sure we've got a way to get that data into our architecture repository so we can actually pull these different disparate viewpoints together. And, hopefully whatever, tool you are using has some, extension capabilities like we saw in Enterprise Architect, where we created scripts to, automatically build diagrams since the relationships had already been established, through other means. No reason to have to replicate that stuff diagrammatically, at least the manual effort required to do that. And then using various attributes and algorithms to, color code different types of heat maps or life cycle diagrams based on the values of some of that metadata. So we basically want to close up. We may have a couple minutes here for some questions, but certainly want to extend to everybody the opportunity to participate in some free web-based TOGAF certification training. And if you got any additional questions about this or anything else related to enterprise architecture and TOGAF, Archimate and Sparks, by no means don't hesitate to contact us. Again, I'll be working with Birgit at the AEA on our next session, tentatively scheduled from a month from now, with the candidate topic being technology lifecycle management. So again, thanks so much for your attention and participation, and if there's any questions that I can address in the next couple minutes, I'd be happy to do that.
Chris, we have a question from, I don't know if you can see it, from Michael Trapani, and he says, in the CBP Metamodel, it was unclear how you would formally differentiate business capabilities and IT capabilities. Does the methodology not support that?
Well, let me go back and we can take a quick look at the Metamodel. All right, there you go. And, so, it turns out that, these are just called capabilities, so we're not making the differentiation between business capabilities and IT capabilities for a couple of reasons. I mean, we're talking about the IT for IT reference architecture, and the capabilities that are within that model, like we can, take a quick look here on the disposition heat map, are things like, requirements management, IT portfolio management, architecture, project management. Well, these are business capabilities that happen to do with running the business of IT, but there's nothing about those capabilities that are any different from, frontline business capabilities. However, one of the things that we have seen, and that's represented here by the capability category, is, we certainly can think of, the IT for IT capabilities, generally speaking, are supporting capabilities in the context of the overall enterprise, namely, unless you're an IT service management company or an IT consulting company, like ABG, those IT for IT capabilities are things that you have to do to stay in business, but they're not why you're in business. If you're in property and casualty insurance, you're there to, create products, sell products, service products, manage claims, and all that sort of stuff. Or if you're in manufacturing, you've got a different value chain and set of capabilities. So that's what we really consider to be the core capabilities. And again, IT for IT would typically be supporting capabilities. But then some of the work that we've done, we've actually come up with a third type capability, which is an enabling capability. And an enabling capability, well, is likely, neither core nor supporting, but it's a capability that really enables other capabilities to perform effectively. And what we find is a lot of times those enabling capabilities are very technology focused. So this would not be IT business capabilities. These would be technology capabilities that have to do with things like, big data or social media analytics or, mobile or so on and so forth that are, again, really key to making and supporting, enabling your capability model and the operationalization of that at your enterprise. So hopefully that was, not too long-winded of an answer.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think we're just about, I don't know if you have time, Chris, we do have one more question.
Sure, I can do one more.
Great. Again, from Michael, I see versioning, road mapping, capability for IT model, processes, and applications. We are looking at roadmaps for capabilities. Is that something the Metamodel supports, or is it under consideration for the future?
So again, the capability, the Metamodel we're seeing here is really focusing on the capability model and the two primary elements we chose to map to it, processes and applications. So again, that's a part of tailoring. But then if we go take a look at some of the other views of the Metamodel, because again, this is not the entire Metamodel, it's just a subset of it related to capability-based planning. But then we can get into, again, the Roadmap Metamodel, where we have, again, plateaus associated with any kind of architectural element. And what's not expressed in these diagrams, so maybe that's the source of the question, is an architecture. There are many different types of architecture elements, namely capabilities, processes, applications, functions, services, and so forth. So the generic capability-based, more of the planning road mapping part of the Metamodel is set up to accommodate dealing with any type of element in your capability-based roadmap.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think that's it. Thank you for another fabulous and informative webinar in our series, and we certainly look forward to having the next one with you, and that should be a month from this month. So thanks again, and again, this session is recorded and will be available to AEA members along with the presentation. So thank you all to have participated today, and thank you, Chris.
Thanks very much, everybody, and have a great weekend.